Sonia walked in wearing the wrong dress for a family dinner. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her face. Not the way she positioned herself slightly ahead of Camila as they moved through the restaurant toward our table. The dress, black, structured, pressed like she had steamed it that morning for something that mattered. Women wear dresses like that when they are going somewhere significant, not to a Tuesday night dinner with their daughters-in-laws. That dress was chosen, and the moment I saw it, I filed the information quietly in the place where I keep things. I am not ready to speak out loud yet. I am Beatriz Montero. I have lived in Atlanta for 31 years, raised one son in this city, and built a professional life on the currency that matters most in the rooms I move through. My word. I know how to read a room before the room knows it is being read. And what I read that Tuesday evening from the moment Sonia Ferreira walked through that restaurant door was that I had not been invited to a dinner. I had been invited to a conclusion. If you are watching this right now, drop the time in the comments. I want to know what hour found you here. The food came. Conversation moved the way conversation moves when people are performing normally. Careful, surface level. Nobody saying the thing that is already sitting in the middle of the table. Camila asked about nothing that mattered. Raphael talked about the project the way he always talked about it around me lately, briefly, with a particular kind of redirect that I had noticed but not named. Sonia smiled at everything and said very little. She was conserving herself. I understand that now. Then Camila stood up. She didn't excuse herself. Didn't reach for her purse. She stood up from her seat with the deliberate movement of a woman executing something she had rehearsed, walked around the table to my side, and stopped directly beside me. Sonia was 2 steps behind her before I even processed that she had moved. They had done this before, not this specifically but the formation. The way Sonia positioned herself as a wall behind her daughter told me this was a structure they had practiced in some version. Camila looked down at me and said it calm, measured. Each word placed like furniture. She told me she was pregnant. Told me the best gift I could give my grandchild was to disappear. Forever. She used that word. Forever. Standing at a restaurant table in Atlanta with her mother at her back and my son sitting 3 feet away. I turned to look at Raphael. He didn't hesitate, didn't look away, looked directly at me and said, "That's right, baby." 3 words spoken with the ease of a man who had already made his peace with them long before tonight. I sat with that for 3 full seconds. Then I stood, reached for my napkin, folded it once, twice, placed it on the table with the kind of precision that only comes when every other part of you is working very hard to stay contained. Nobody at that table spoke. The couple 2 tables over had gone quiet. The silence had weight, and everyone in that room was sitting underneath it. I reached for my purse. That is when Sonia smiled. Not at Camila, at me. Direct, deliberate. The smile of a woman who believed she had just watched something finish. I did not smile back. I did not speak. I felt something move through me that was not grief and was not rage. It was clarity. The specific, irreversible clarity that arrives when something you have suspected quietly for a long time finally decides to show you its face. I was not broken at that table. I picked up my purse, pushed back my chair, and walked out of that restaurant into the Atlanta night without a word to anyone. By the time I reached my car, I had already decided. I pulled out my phone, called one number. Adriana picked up on the second ring. "I need you to listen," I said. "I'm leaving tonight." The skyline was still visible in my rear-view mirror when I passed the last Atlanta exit on Interstate 20 westbound. I watched it shrink the way you watch something you built slowly disappear. Not with panic, but with the particular ache of a woman who knows exactly what she is leaving behind and why she is leaving it anyway. My bag was in the back seat. One bag. I had packed it in 23 minutes without sitting down once. I was not crying. I was remembering. 12 years ago, I joined the Southwest Atlanta Community Development Board. Not because someone invited me, because I showed up to a public meeting about a corridor that was being quietly abandoned. And I was the only person in that room who asked the question nobody else asked. Not what the city planned to do, but what the community had already tried. That question got me a seat. The seat got me a board position. And the board position on a Saturday morning in October got me standing on a cracked sidewalk in work gloves next to a man named Hector Villalobos. He wasn't there as an investor that morning. He was there because that block mattered to him personally, a detail he never publicized and I never repeated. We picked up trash side by side for 2 hours before we exchanged a single word beyond logistics. When we finally did talk, it was not about money or development or opportunity. It was about what a neighborhood looks like when the people who built it decide it is still worth fighting for. That conversation lasted 40 minutes. It laid the foundation for everything that followed. The relationship built across years after that. Phone calls, referrals, Hector watching how I moved through Atlanta's civic world with the patience of a man who understood that trust is not granted. It is observed. My word opened doors in those years. Not because I pushed them, but because I never gave my word carelessly. Every introduction I made held. Every project I touched I stayed with. By the time Rafael came to me 3 years ago with a development concept, Hector Villalobos had spent a decade learning what my judgment was worth. He didn't need convincing. He needed confirmation. Rafael's concept was good. Mixed development in a southwest Atlanta redevelopment zone, retail ground floor, residential above, planted in a corridor that needed exactly that kind of investment. I believed in the project. More than that, I believed in what it could do for the people on those blocks. I made the introduction to Hector personally. Sat in that first meeting and watched Hector study my son the way he studied everyone. Not with warmth, but with the specific patience of a man deciding whether what he was seeing was real. After that meeting, Hector called me privately. I have never told anyone what he said. He told me he would move forward on one condition, that I remained involved, not visibly, not as a named partner in any public document, just present, my name on the underlying structure, my judgment accessible if the project hit a wall. He did not want Rafael's ambition. He wanted my foundation underneath it. I agreed. And I never told Rafael that call happened. I told myself it was protection, that I didn't want him carrying the weight of knowing his opportunity came with a condition attached to his mother's name. But driving west through Georgia, dark, with my phone face down on the passenger seat, I understood something I had been avoiding for 3 years. That protection was also a blindness. I had shielded him so completely from the architecture of what I built that he grew up inside it without ever learning what held the ceiling up. He didn't betray me out of pure malice. He betrayed me out of ignorance. That distinction does not excuse him, but it clarifies him. And right now, clarity is the only thing I have that belongs entirely to me. The phone buzzed. I glanced down. Rafael. I watched it ring out. Then another call, then another. I turned the screen face down and drove west into the dark. At 6:14 a.m., Rafael Montero was standing in front of a bathroom mirror in a suit that cost more than his first car, and he looked like a man who had already won. Behind him through the open door, Camila was on the phone with her mother, laughing about something. The sound of that laughter moved through the apartment the way certainty moves through people who have never been wrong about anything important. Easy, unguarded, filling every room it touched. The deal closed at 10 a.m. This was the morning they had been building toward. And as far as every person in that apartment was concerned, the only thing left to do was show up and sign. Rafael had invited Camila and Sonia to the closing himself. That detail matters. Nobody pushed for it. He wanted them there. He wanted the 2 women who had helped him see his situation clearly, as he understood it, sitting in that conference room when the documents were executed and the funds released and everything became official and real. He wanted witnesses to what he had built. What he believed he had built largely through his own effort. Not because he thought his mother's introduction hadn't mattered, but because somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that introductions belonged to the beginning of stories and that the hard work that followed belonged to him. The development attorney's office was on Peachtree Street, conference room reserved, Hector's representative flying in from Charlotte. By 7 a.m., Rafael's attorney had already sent written confirmation to all parties. Everyone required would be present at 10 a.m. Rafael read that email twice, filed it as settled. His phone showed 23 outgoing missed calls to his mother by that same hour. He set it face down on the bathroom counter. Told Camila when she came in that his mother probably just needed space to process. Camila nodded and said her mother had warned her Beatriz would find a way to make this moment about herself. Raphael accepted that framing without examination. He had already decided what he believed about his mother's silence. It was inconvenient. It was not alarming. More importantly, he believed the project had already reached the stage where the important decisions had been made. Whatever role Beatriz once played, he saw it now as something behind him rather than beneath him. Today was too important to let her absence become its own conversation. Sonia arrived at 8:30 wearing another considered outfit, structured jacket. Everything pressed. She moved through Raphael's apartment with the ease of a woman who had already taken ownership of a room before she entered it. She kissed Camila's cheek, squeezed Raphael's arm and said simply, "Today is the day." Nobody disagreed. They arrived at the Peachtree Street office at 9:05. The conference room was everything a closing room should be. Long table, leather chairs, water glasses already set. Raphael took the head position without being directed to it. Camila and Sonia sat together on his right. His attorney arranged documents on the table with the efficient quiet of a man who had done this many times before. Marcelo Gutierrez arrived at 9:15, earlier than expected. He was a composed man. 9 years with Hector's group, the kind of professional whose face gave very little away until he chose to give something. He shook hands around the table, accepted coffee, set his briefcase on the floor beside his chair without opening it. The room settled into the particular tension of people waiting for a process to begin. Then Marcelo looked across the table at Raphael and asked one question. "Is Ms. Montero joining us this morning?" He did not ask it the way a person asks about someone who might be running late. He asked it the way a person asks about a document they were specifically told would be present. The phrasing flat, the eyes steady, waiting for a confirmation. Not an explanation. Raphael said she had been held up but would join shortly. Marcelo nodded once slowly, did not reach for his briefcase. Camila glanced at Sonia. Sonia gave her a small, reassuring nod across the table. Everything was fine. Beatriz was irrelevant. This was still their morning. At 9:48, Marcelo excused himself to make a phone call. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he sat down, set both hands flat on the table and said, "I need to share something with the room before we proceed." Marcelo Gutierrez did not clear his throat before he spoke. He did not apologize for what he was about to say or soften it with preliminary pleasantries. He reached into his briefcase, removed a single document, and placed it in the center of the table with the flat precision of a man who had delivered difficult information before and understood that the delivery itself was a form of respect. The room watched him do it. The document was not long, 4 pages. Marcelo opened it to page 3, turned it to face the table, and read the relevant section aloud in the even tone of someone reciting something that had always been true and was only now being heard for the first time. It was an escrow condition, a private side letter attached to the original deal structure at formation, never filed publicly, never visible in any record search that relied on public documents alone. Beatriz Montero's name appeared twice in the section he read. Once as co-signatory required for the anchor parcel transfer, once as confirmed advisory participant whose acknowledgement was necessary before escrow could release. Marcelo set the document down. Did not elaborate. Let the language do what language does when it is precise and unambiguous. Raphael picked it up. Read it. Read it again. His face did not change in any way that another person might notice from across a table. But his right hand, which had been resting loosely on the arm of his chair, moved slowly to the tabletop and went flat. The kind of stillness that is not calm but is working very hard to appear that way. Camila leaned forward and read it herself. Then she looked at her mother. Sonia's face in that moment was the most honest it had been all morning. Not frightened, not angry. Recalibrating. The expression of a woman who had built a structure on a set of facts, and was now looking at a fact she had not included. Raphael told Marcelo the clause was procedural, that it could be amended. His voice was controlled, but the word procedural landed slightly too quickly. The word of a man reaching for footing. Marcelo told him it could not be amended without Hector's direct authorization. He explained that he had spoken with Hector's office that morning and had not received authorization to proceed without satisfaction of the condition. Until that authorization existed, escrow remained frozen and the closing could not proceed. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience with the tone of a man who was professionally sorry and personally unmoved. Sonia spoke for the first time since Marcelo returned from his phone call. She asked how long that clause had been in the agreement. Her voice was measured, controlled, the voice of a woman who already suspected the answer and was asking anyway because the answer needed to be in the room. Marcelo told her the condition had been part of the transaction structure from the beginning, maintained in Hector's closing package and carried forward through every stage of the deal. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The earlier silence had been anticipatory, the held breath of people waiting for something to begin. This silence was the sound of a room absorbing something it could not undo. Sonia had searched every public record available before advising Camila. She had found the anchor parcel. She had found nothing that appeared to give Beatriz an active role in the current structure. No filings, no registrations, no public instruments indicating decision-making authority. She had concluded from that absence that Beatriz's role was ceremonial, historical at best. What she had not accounted for was the possibility that the most consequential structures are never the ones that announce themselves in public documents. Camila turned to look at her mother, not with panic, with a question. The first genuinely unscripted question she had directed at Sonia in this entire process. Sonia did not meet her daughter's eyes. She looked at the document, reading it the way you read something when you are no longer looking for what you expect to find, but for what you missed. Raphael pushed back from the table, excused himself, walked into the hallway, and called his mother. Osmo. Called again. Osmo. He stood against the wall of that Peachtree Street building in his expensive suit and called a third time. No message. Just silence on the line. And in that silence, slowly, something he had refused to consider all morning began to take shape. The hotel was on a street I had walked as a girl, Birmingham. I chose it the same way I had chosen everything in the last 12 hours. Quickly, precisely, without second-guessing. Nobody from Atlanta would look for me here first. That was the only qualification that mattered at 2:47 a.m. when I pulled off the interstate and found the first decent hotel with a vacancy sign still lit. I checked in under my name because I was not hiding. I was simply unavailable. There is a difference, and it matters. I slept 4 hours, woke at 7 a.m. to a phone that had already been working without me. I made coffee from the machine on the dresser, carried it to the chair by the window, set it on the sill, and did not drink it. Outside, Birmingham was doing what Birmingham does on a Wednesday morning, moving, unhurried, indifferent to anything happening in a hotel room one floor up. I watched my phone on the table instead. Watched the screen light up and go dark. Light up and go dark with the rhythm of people who had expected this day to go differently. By noon, the count was at 47. By 3 p.m. it was at 71. Raphael. Camila. A number I didn't recognize that called twice in a row. Raphael again. I watched each one arrive and expire without touching the phone. Not because I felt nothing, because I felt everything and had not yet decided what to do with it. This was not satisfaction. I want to be precise about that because it matters. There was no part of me sitting in that Birmingham hotel room enjoying what was happening in Atlanta. What I felt was grief dressed in stillness. The specific weight of loving someone before you understood what they were capable of and then understanding it and having to hold both versions of them in the same chest at the same time. I had loved my son completely for 34 years. That love did not disappear at a restaurant table on a Tuesday night. It just had nowhere clean to land anymore. At 4:17 p.m., a call came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Listened to the message the moment the notification appeared. The voice was measured, professional, unhurried. The man identified himself as Marcelo Gutierrez. He said Mr. Villalobos had asked him to reach out to me directly. He left a callback number. He said the matter was time-sensitive and that Mr. Villalobos's preference was to speak with me before end of business. I sat with that message for a full minute before I moved. Marcelo's call told me something more important than anything Rafael's 47 attempts had communicated. Hector Villalobos had understood what my absence meant before anyone else in that building had finished reading the escrow addendum. He had not sent Marcelo to pressure me or negotiate around me. He had sent Marcelo because he knew me well enough to know that I had not disappeared. I had withdrawn, and those are entirely different things. I picked up the phone, did not call Marcelo back yet. Called Adriana first. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the voicemail, read her the key line. Adriana was quiet for a moment in the way she gets quiet when she is processing something that confirms what she already suspected. Then she said, "He already knows, doesn't he?" Not a question, a conclusion. I said, "He's always known." We stayed on the phone another few minutes without saying much else. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones where two people simply confirm to each other that they are reading the same thing correctly. By midnight, the count reached 98. I know the exact number because I had been watching. The 98th call came at 11:58 p.m. from a number I recognized immediately. Not Marcelo's office line, not the development attorney. Hector Villalobos's personal number, the one fewer than 10 people in Atlanta had. He was not routing through anyone anymore. He was calling me himself from his private line at midnight. I watched his name on the screen until the call expired, set the phone down on the sill next to the cold coffee, picked it back up and called Marcelo. Sonia Josephine Ferreira had spent 40 years being the smartest woman in every room she entered. That was not always an unfair assessment. She was sharp, prepared, and methodical in the way that women who have never been handed anything learn to be methodical. She had built a reputation in her own circles on the strength of that preparation. Years serving on redevelopment committees, neighborhood boards, and civic planning groups had taught her how to read public records, trace ownership structures, and follow the paper trail behind projects that affected communities. She researched before she moved. She confirmed before she advised. She did not walk into rooms she had not already mapped. What she had not accounted for was a room that looked fully mapped, but wasn't. 8 months before the dinner, Camila mentioned almost in passing that Rafael's mother had been the one to originally introduce the investor. That detail sat in Sonia's mind for 3 days before she acted on it. Then she began pulling records. Public filings with the city, the development entity registered in Georgia, the operating agreement naming Rafael as principal. She was thorough in the way a woman is thorough when she believes the answer she is looking for is simply a matter of finding the right document. She found Rafael's name everywhere it needed to be. She found the project structure clean and registered. She found one thing connected to Beatriz Montero, the anchor parcel. Beatriz's name appeared in older property records connected to land that had eventually become part of the broader development footprint. Sonia noted it, looked at it, followed it as far as the available records allowed. Then she moved on. The parcel appeared inactive. No public filing connected it directly to the current operating structure. No document she could access suggested it carried decision-making authority. To Sonia, it looked like the residue of an earlier stage of the project. Important once perhaps, but no longer central. That conclusion became the hinge. Everything else swung on it. She told Camila that Beatriz's role in the deal was historical, that she had made an introduction years ago and had been riding that introduction ever since. Showing up at family events, maintaining proximity, positioning herself as relevant to a project that had long since moved past her original contribution. She told Camila that the dinner was not cruelty. It was clarity. That removing Beatriz from the picture before the closing protected Rafael from a woman who would eventually want recognition that could complicate everything. Camila believed her. She had no framework that would have allowed her not to. What Sonia never found, because it was never in any public record, because it was structured specifically to exist outside the reach of anyone conducting a standard record search, was the escrow condition. A private side letter between Hector Villalobos and Beatriz Montero executed at the formation of the deal, filed with nothing, held in the closing package that Hector's office controlled entirely. It was not hidden in a conspiratorial sense. It was simply private in the way that the most consequential agreements between people who trust each other are often private. No announcement, no public record. Just two people who had spent 12 years learning what the other's word was worth, putting that understanding in writing and keeping it between themselves. Sonia had spent 40 years in rooms where power announced itself. Where the person with leverage made sure you knew they had it. Where the most important document was always the one sitting visibly on the table. She had built her entire understanding of how these situations worked on that architecture. She had never been required to account for the possibility that the parcel she dismissed as historical was still structurally important, or that a private agreement existed beyond the reach of every search she conducted. That was the miscalculation. Not stupidity, not carelessness. The specific practiced arrogance of a woman who had confused the absence of visible evidence with the absence of power. Those are not the same thing. Beatriz Montero had known that for 30 years. Sonia was learning it now. By evening, she was alone in Camila's kitchen. Hector Villalobos called at 8:03 a.m., and I answered on the third ring. I had watched his name on my screen at midnight and let the call expire because I was not ready then. I knew what the conversation required, and I was not yet in a place where I could enter it correctly. By morning I had slept 3 hours, washed my face, made fresh coffee that I actually drank this time, and sat in the chair by the window until Birmingham's early light told me it was time to stop waiting and start moving. He did not begin with the deal. That was the first thing that confirmed what I already understood about Hector Villalobos. A smaller man would have led with the business, the timeline, the pressure his partners were applying. Hector led with, "Beatriz, are you all right?" Not shaped like a question. Shaped like a man who had known me long enough to understand that my leaving Atlanta without a word meant something real had happened, and who believed that the real thing deserved to be acknowledged before anything else. I told him enough, not everything. There are parts of what happened at that table that belonged to me, and I was not prepared to hand them to anyone, not even Hector. But I told him the shape of it. The dinner. Camila. What Raphael said. He listened the way he had always listened, without filling the silence, without rushing toward a response, without performing sympathy he didn't feel. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to know that what happened at that table has no bearing on what I think of you or what I have understood about this deal from the very beginning." I sat with those words. It was the first time in 36 hours that someone had said something to me that did not require me to translate it before I could use it. It meant exactly what it said. Then he told me the business reality. His equity partners had a closing window and he could not hold the structure indefinitely. If the escrow condition was not satisfied within 72 hours, he would have no choice but to suspend the current closing process and reassess the structure from the ground up. He said it plainly, without apology and without pressure. He was informing me of a fact, not issuing a warning. I heard the difference and it steadied me. Then he reminded me of something I had not thought about in a long time. When the project was originally being structured, his attorneys had insisted on creating several protections around the deal. Some were for financing, some were for governance, some were intended to address situations nobody expected to happen, but responsible attorneys prepare for anyway. One of those protections involved me. Not because Hector was planning to hand me something later, because the attorneys involved believed that anyone whose participation was structurally important should have clearly defined rights if circumstances changed. At the time, none of us expected those provisions to matter. The project was supposed to move forward cleanly. Life had other ideas. Then he told me about the conversation with Raphael. Several months ago, Raphael had asked Hector directly whether my involvement was still necessary. Hector had told him my involvement was foundational, not procedural, not historical, foundational, and that the question itself was the wrong one to be asking. Raphael said he understood, did not ask a follow-up. Let the conversation close. Hector said he had taken that silence as comprehension. He understood now it was something else. I was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then I asked him, when Raphael asked if I was still necessary, what did you think he was really asking? Tur paused. I thought he was asking for permission to stop worrying about it. I told him he didn't need permission and that the question was wrong. Another pause. I think now he heard that as a yes. The line held between us for a moment without either of us filling it. I reached for the hotel notepad on the nightstand, wrote 2 words. 72 hours. Underlined them once. Set the pen down. Then I called Adriana. She picked up before the second ring. I said 4 words. I need Rodrigo Castillo's number. Adriana did not call ahead to say she was coming. She drove 2 hours and 14 minutes from Atlanta to Birmingham. And when I opened the hotel room door, she walked straight past the threshold, sat down in the chair by the window, the one I had been living in since I arrived, set her purse on the floor and said, "Tell me everything." No preamble, no performance of concern. Just the directness of a woman who had known me long enough to understand that what I needed was not comfort. It was witness. So I told her everything. The dinner, Sonia's dress, Camila's rehearsed delivery. The 3 words Raphael spoke without hesitation. The folded napkin, the drive, the hotel, Marcelo's voicemail arriving at 4:17 p.m. while I sat watching calls accumulate like evidence. Hector's call at midnight from his personal line. The 72-hour window. The equity stake Hector had been holding to present at a closing table that never happened. I told her all of it in the order it occurred without editorializing, without breaking down. Adriana listened the way she has always listened, without rushing toward comfort, without manufacturing the appropriate expression. She just received it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for what to say. The quiet of someone deciding whether now was the right time for what they had been carrying. Then she said, "There's something I need to tell you. I found out 2 days ago, and I didn't know how to bring it to you until now." 3 weeks before the dinner, Camila had called her, not to confide, to verify. Camila had been unsettled by something her mother told her, and needed a voice outside Sonia's orbit to tell her whether she was reading the situation correctly. In that conversation, Camila revealed that Sonia had arranged a private meeting with Raphael without Camila present. In that meeting, Raphael had told Sonia he was prepared to move forward without my active involvement in the closing process, that he was concerned my continued presence would complicate things. He used the word complicated. Adriana said it carefully, watching my face as she did. I stood up, walked to the window, stood there with my back to her, and looked out at Birmingham, at the street I grew up on, at the ordinary Wednesday afternoon moving below me without any awareness of what was happening 1 floor up. Complicated his own mother. The woman who called Hector Villalobos personally and put her 31 years of credibility behind her son's name. The woman who held an anchor parcel in her name for 3 years so he would have something real beneath his feet. The woman who stepped back every time he asked her to step back, who made herself smaller every time the room required it, who protected him so completely from the weight of what she carried that he grew up believing the weight didn't exist. He sat with his wife's mother in a private conversation he did not tell his wife about and called me a complication. When I turned around, my voice had changed. Lower. Each sentence arriving separately with space around it. He didn't humiliate me at that table. Camila did that. Sonia designed it. But Raphael, I started again. He sat in a room with that woman and told her his mother was something to be managed in private, so he would never have to say it to my face. I looked at Adriana directly. I am done being the reason he doesn't feel the weight of his own decisions. The room held that for a moment. I picked up my phone, called Rodrigo Castillo. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Rodrigo, I need to move on the parcel tonight if possible." I listened, nodded once. "Good. I'll send you everything in the morning." I ended the call, sat back down across from Adriana, looked at her steadily. Now let's talk about what comes next. Rodrigo Castillo called me back at 6:23 a.m. I had sent him 3 things at exactly 6 o'clock. The escrow addendum, the parcel deed, and 2 paragraphs summarizing the situation without editorializing. Rodrigo did not need my feelings about what happened. He needed the documents and the facts in the order they occurred. I gave him that and waited. 23 minutes later, his name appeared on my screen and I answered before the first ring completed. He said, "You're in a stronger position than you probably realize." Those 10 words did more for me than anything said in the previous 3 days. Not because they were reassuring. Rodrigo was not a man who reassured people. He was a man who assessed situations and reported what he found, which is exactly why those words landed the way they did. He was not telling me what I needed to hear. He was telling me what the document said. Then he reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. 3 years earlier, when the parcel had first been positioned for the development structure, Rodrigo had reviewed portions of the documentation for a separate matter. Not the deal itself, just enough of the underlying records to understand how the property was being held and why. That familiarity meant he was not starting from zero now. He already knew the foundation. What I had sent him that morning simply showed him where the foundation connected to the current dispute. By mid-morning, he prepared a formal protective filing on the anchor parcel, a legal instrument that prevented any transfer, any encumbrance, or any use of that property without my direct written authorization. It was not an aggressive move. It was a precise one. The difference between a woman retaliating and a woman protecting what was already hers. Clean documentation, no ambiguity, no language that could be characterized as hostile. Just the quiet, unambiguous assertion of a position that had always existed and was now formally on record. He also drafted a letter to Marcelo, professional in tone. It confirmed my legal standing relative to the escrow condition and communicated my availability to discuss a path forward on my terms, on my timeline. Rodrigo sent both documents to me for review at 9:47 a.m. I read them from the chair by the hotel window, approved them, signed electronically. Felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt since before the dinner. Not triumph, not relief in the way relief usually arrives, but the specific calm of a person who had moved correctly after days of holding still. I had not gone after anyone. I had simply stopped leaving myself unprotected. At 11 a.m. Rodrigo called back. Rafael had retained an attorney. Young, Rodrigo said, with a particular brevity he used when he meant to communicate more than the word itself. The attorney had already contacted Marcelo's office that morning, suggesting the escrow condition was challengeable on procedural grounds, that the side letter had not been properly incorporated into the main agreement and therefore carried no enforceable weight. Rodrigo told me he was not concerned. The condition was airtight, the incorporation was clean, and the challenge would not survive a serious review. But he wanted me to know the move had been made. I appreciated that. Knowing what was in motion was not the same as being threatened by it. Then he mentioned something else. The right of participation provision Hector and his attorneys had discussed years earlier was still sitting exactly where it had always been in the founding documents. Nobody had removed it. Nobody had exercised it. And because the original closing had never occurred, it remained available. I had not thought about that provision in a long time. Hector's attorney mentioned it briefly when the entity was formed, almost as a contingency neither of us expected to use. The deal was always supposed to close. I had filed it in the back of my mind and left it there. It had never been exercised. Had never expired. Rodrigo emailed the language for me to review. When it arrived I read it once, then read it again. Then I sat back in the chair and laughed. Not loudly, not triumphantly. One small, quiet laugh for the patience of a structure that had spent 3 years waiting in a document nobody expected to revisit. My phone buzzed while I was still holding the provision on my screen. Rafael. Not a call, a text message. 4 words. Mama, please come home. I read it. Set the phone face down on the windowsill. Looked out at the Birmingham street below. The same street I had walked as a girl. The same light. The same unhurried morning moving below me without any knowledge of what it was holding up. I said nothing at all. The front desk called at 9:41 a.m. A Rafael Montero was in the lobby asking for my room number. I held the phone for a moment after the clerk finished speaking. Then I told her to send him up. I did not change what I was wearing. Did not straighten the room or move the notepad on the nightstand with 72 hours written and underlined on it. Did not rehearse a single word. I sat in the chair by the window and waited for the knock. He had driven the same road I drove 3 nights ago, Interstate 20 westbound. I learned that detail later, that he had left Atlanta at 7 a.m. without telling Camila where he was going, without calling Sonia for counsel, without consulting anyone. He had simply gotten in his car and whatever he grabbed off a chair in the dark and driven toward Birmingham the way a man drives when he has run out of every other option and finally understands that the only conversation that matters is the one he has been avoiding. When I opened the door, he looked like 4 days of bad decisions wearing a tired face. The expensive suit was gone. He looked younger without it, smaller. He looked, for the first time since this all began, like my son rather than the man who had been performing confidence at a closing table. I stepped aside. He came in, sat on the edge of the bed because the chair was mine and I had not offered it. I sat back down across from him and waited. He started talking. It began as an explanation. The pressures of the deal, Sonia's counsel, how things had moved faster than he anticipated. Then it became an apology. Then it drifted into justification, which circled back into apology, which lost itself somewhere in the middle of a sentence he couldn't finish. He talked for several minutes. Let him. I did not interrupt, and I did not help him find the words he kept dropping. He had come to Birmingham to say something. I was willing to wait until he located it. When he finally stopped, I asked him one question. When Sonia asked you if I was still necessary, what did you tell her? The silence after that question was longer than any answer he could have given. He looked at the floor, then at his hands. Then he said he told Sonia he thought it was time to handle things independently, that he felt the deal had reached a stage where he could manage it without. He stopped before finishing the sentence. Said without me. He didn't correct it. I said, and did you think about what independently actually meant? What was underneath that deal before you decided you were ready to stand on it alone? Then I told him all of it. Hector's condition after the first meeting. The private call I never disclosed. Escrow clause. The anchor parcel sitting in my name for 3 years because Hector required my name on the structure before he would move a single dollar. Everything I had carried quietly so he could walk into rooms feeling like the principal. I did not raise my voice. I did not frame it as accusation. I laid it out the way you lay out a set of facts in order, without decoration, with nothing omitted. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I didn't know. I looked at him steadily. I know you didn't. That's the part one carry. I protected you so completely that you couldn't see what you were standing on. When someone told you to step off it, you had no way of understanding what that meant. Pause. That is partly on me, but only partly. He sat with that, did not argue it, did not reach for a defense. I told him what moving forward required. Not money, not legal arrangements yet. He needed to go home and tell Camila the full truth. Hector's condition, the parcel, all of it. Not a version shaped for comfort. The full truth. Then he needed to call me. He stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and didn't turn around. I'm sorry, Mama. I said. I know you are, Raphael. He left. I sat back down, picked up my phone, called Rodrigo. When he answered, I said 2 words. Atlanta's professional community is not large. Not the part that matters. The civic boards, the development corridors, the church networks, the quiet rooms where Black Atlanta decides what gets built and who gets trusted. That world operates on a scale that looks expansive from the outside and reveals itself as intimate the moment you need something contained. Information in that world does not travel through gossip. Travels through pattern recognition. People who have spent decades watching how situations develop learn to read a sequence of events the way a doctor reads symptoms, not by what is announced, but by what the sequence itself suggests. Within 48 hours of the failed signing, the development attorney's office updated the deal file. Rodrigo's protective notice had been received. Marcelo's communication confirming Beatrice's legal standing had been logged. The file now reflected in plain documented language that the closing had not proceeded, and that Beatriz Montero's position relative to the escrow condition and the anchor parcel was active and legally protected. Every party copied on the closing correspondence received that update automatically. Sonia was copied. Her attorney was copied. The adjustment to the file said nothing accusatory. It did not need to. A legal record that places your name adjacent to a collapsed closing and a reinstated claim tells its own story to anyone who knows how to read one. 2 days after the failed signing, a board member of the Southwest Atlanta Community Development Board called a colleague, a woman who had known Beatriz for 11 years, to ask what she had heard about the Montero development project. That conversation moved to a third person by afternoon. By the time it reached its fifth, the outline was accurate in every essential detail. A woman who helped build the deal had been pushed out by her son's in-laws. The closing collapsed. The investor was reassessing the structure with Beatriz positioned at the center of discussions. Nobody sensationalized it. Nobody needed to. The facts were sufficient. Sonia heard the outline was circulating. On the third day, she made calls, reached out to 2 people she had considered reliable allies in Atlanta's civic network, women she had worked alongside on committees, sat next to at functions, exchanged favors with in the particular currency of professional goodwill. Both conversations were polite. Both were shorter than she expected. One ended with a phrase delivered in the particular register of Southern courtesy that carries no actual warmth beneath it. "I hope everything works out for y'all." Sonia had used that phrase herself enough times to understand precisely what it meant. The door was not closing. It had already closed. The story had not been started by Beatriz. It had not been carried by Adriana. It had moved through attorneys, investors, consultants, and board members, not as deliberate disclosure, but as the natural consequence of a failed closing that involved multiple professional parties in a city where those parties were never more than 2 conversations apart from anyone who mattered. A private miscalculation does not remain private when it produces public consequences in a room full of witnesses. What unsettled people was not the family conflict. Atlanta had seen family conflict before. It was the growing understanding that Sonia had involved herself in a major development matter without possessing the full facts, had advised others with confidence she could not support, and had helped create a chain of events that nearly derailed a project affecting multiple stakeholders. In professional circles, bad judgment travels farther than bad intentions. 2 weeks later, the board's governance committee met to review several upcoming appointments and renewals. Sonia's term was among them. The failed development matter was not the only thing discussed. Committee members had already raised concerns over the previous year about discretion, judgment, and several situations where Sonia's confidence had exceeded the information available to her. None of those concerns alone had been decisive. The Montero matter changed that. No one mentioned the restaurant. No one discussed family matters. What they discussed instead was trust, discretion, and judgment. The qualities community boards depend on more than expertise. When the final recommendations were submitted, Sonia's name was not among those recommended for another term. No confrontation, no formal statement, just a name that was not called when names were called. Sonia called Camila that evening. It was the first conversation between them since the collapse that did not have a strategy underneath it. Sonia said she may have underestimated the situation. Camila, who had watched her husband dissolve across 4 days and then drive to Birmingham alone without a word to anyone, was not in a generous place. She said, "Mama, I need to know exactly what you told Raphael about Beatriz. All of it. Because I am starting to understand that I have been operating inside a story you wrote and handed to me and told me was the truth." She did not wait for an answer. She hung up. Then she sat in the living room of the house she shared with Raphael, picked up her phone, opened her contacts, and scrolled until she found a name. She stared at it for a long time without pressing it. The name was Beatriz Montero. She called at 10 p.m. I was back in Atlanta by then. Had driven back 2 days after Raphael's visit, quietly without announcement. My house was exactly as I had left it. I had walked through every room the night I returned the way you walk through a space you need to reclaim, touching nothing, just moving through it until it felt like mine again. I was sitting in my kitchen when the phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. Camila had never called me directly. Not once in 3 years of being Raphael's wife. Everything between us had always moved through him or through occasion, holidays, dinners, the managed proximity of a family that had never fully decided what it was to each other. We were never hostile. We were never close either. Most of what Camila believed she knew about me had arrived secondhand through Raphael, through her mother, through conversations where I was the subject but not the participant. Her name on my screen at 10 p.m. on a Thursday was its own kind of information. Before I even answered, I picked up, said nothing, waited. The pause before she spoke was long enough that I could hear her deciding. When her voice came, it was not the voice of the woman who had stood behind her mother at that restaurant table with a rehearsed line and a structured delivery. It was smaller than that, stripped of the architecture that performance requires. She said she wanted to meet. Asked her why. She said, "Because I need to understand what I actually did." I told her I would meet her in Atlanta the following afternoon. One condition. She came alone. No Sonia, no attorney, no Raphael. She agreed before I finished the sentence. The speed of that agreement told me more than the words did. A woman who needed her mother's counsel to feel safe would have hesitated. Camila did not hesitate. She had already decided to come before she made the call. I chose the restaurant, neutral ground, public enough that neither of us was cornered, quiet enough that we could speak at a normal register without managing who heard us. I arrived to find her already seated, water in front of her, hands in her lap. She started to rise when I came through the door and I gestured for her to stay. We had enough ceremony between us already. I sat down and looked at her directly and waited for her to begin. She told me what Sonia had told her. That I had gone to Hector Villalobos privately and told him Raphael was not ready. That I had been working quietly to maintain my own centrality in the deal by undermining my son's credibility with the one man whose opinion determined everything. That the dinner, the confrontation, the line about the grandchild, all of it had been framed to Camila not as cruelty but as defense. A wife protecting her husband from a mother who wanted to remain the most important person in every room he entered. Camila had believed it, not because she hated me, not because we had some history of conflict, because the story arrived from the person she trusted most, supported by selective facts, reinforced over months, and directed at a woman she had never truly known well enough to challenge it. She had taken that story and built her performance at that dinner table on top of it, brick by brick, without ever checking the foundation. I was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then I said, "I never told Hector Villalobos my son wasn't ready. Not once. What I told that man the one time his confidence in Raphael needed reinforcing was that my son was ready and that he could trust him with something real. That is the only conversation I ever had with Hector about Raphael's capability. That is what I said." Camila looked at the table. Something moved through her face that was not simple guilt. It was the specific rearrangement of a person who has just understood that the story they have been living inside was not discovered. It was constructed and handed to them by someone they trusted without question. She said quietly, "My mother lied to me." Not a question, a conclusion arriving without drama. I did not confirm it. I did not need to. The truth was already sitting between us, and we both knew what it was. We sat for another few minutes. Then she said, "I don't know if you can forgive what I did at that table. I don't know if I would forgive it, but I used your grandchild as a weapon. I have to live with that." She stood, left first without looking back. I ordered coffee, sat alone with it, thought about a child who had been used as an instrument before she was even born, and who would arrive in this world with no knowledge of any of it. I made a decision in that quiet, sitting alone at a restaurant table in Atlanta, about what kind of grandmother I intended to be. Not the kind anyone at that dinner table had predicted. My terms, nobody else's. Raphael told Camila everything the morning after she called him from the living room. Not a version shaped for comfort. Not a sequence edited to protect his position. Everything. Hector's condition after the first meeting, the private call Beatrice never disclosed, the escrow clause, what the anchor parcel actually represented, and why Beatrice's name had been on it for 3 years. Camila sat across from him and listened without speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Beatrice, not to report the conversation, not to negotiate anything. She called because hearing it from Raphael's own mouth had finally closed something that had been open and bleeding in her since the restaurant. When Beatrice answered, Camila said, "I understand now." "That was all," Beatrice said. "I know you do." The call lasted less than a minute. It carried more weight than most conversations carry in an hour. The 72-hour window expired that week. The closing was formally suspended, and for the next several weeks, attorneys, lenders, and equity partners did what attorneys, lenders, and equity partners always do when a structure unexpectedly collides with reality. They reviewed everything. Documents were re-examined. Positions were clarified. Assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years were tested against what the governing agreements actually said. Throughout that process, one fact never changed. The anchor parcel held in Beatrice's name for 3 years, the piece of land without which the development could not be structured, remained essential to the project, nor did the participation provision that had existed in the governing documents since formation. What had once seemed unlikely now had to be addressed directly. By the beginning of the following month, Hector Villalobos had arrived at a decision. He made 3 phone calls before 9 a.m. His lead equity partner first, then Marcelo, then Rodrigo Castillo. He did not make those calls to consult. He made them to instruct. The decision was not about punishment and not about loyalty. It was about structure, about aligning the project with the reality that had existed from the beginning rather than continuing under assumptions that had now proven unreliable. Beatrice's participation provision was formally activated. It converted her advisory position into a named equity stake with a defined percentage in the completed project. The operating structure was amended accordingly. Raphael was offered a continuing role in the project. Project manager, not principal. He could accept or decline. Rodrigo called Beatrice with the revised terms later that afternoon. She read every page without rushing. Asked 3 questions about the equity percentage calculation, about the timeline for implementation, about the conditions under which her stake could be affected by project performance. All precise, none emotional. Rodrigo answered each one without elaboration because elaboration was not what she was asking for. She signed where indicated. Raphael received the terms through his own attorney several days later. He called Beatrice. She answered. He asked her directly whether she had asked Hector to reduce his role. His voice was controlled, but the question had an edge. The particular edge of a man who needed to know whether what happened to him was justice or retaliation before he could decide how to carry it. She told him the truth. "I asked Hector to be fair. What fair looked like was his decision." He paused. "You still have a role. You still have a project. What you no longer have is a position built on a foundation you didn't understand and didn't build." Another pause. "That is not punishment, Raphael. That is just what is true." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said he needed to think. She told him to take the time he needed. 3 days later, he instructed his attorney to accept the revised role. Not with grace, not with enthusiasm, with a particular resignation of a man who had finally stopped arguing with reality and started deciding what to do inside it. That shift, quiet, private, witnessed by no one, was the first honest thing he had done in a long time. Rodrigo called Beatrice after the paperwork was confirmed on both sides. The conference room on Peachtree Street looked exactly the same as it had the first time. Same table, same leather chairs, same water glasses set at each position with the quiet efficiency of a room that had no knowledge of what had happened the last time people sat inside it. The building did not know what this second attempt had cost to arrange. The room simply waited, indifferent and prepared for whoever was coming. I arrived first, Rodrigo beside me. We did not speak much in the elevator or in the corridor. There was nothing left to prepare, and we both understood that. I set my bag on the chair, placed my copy of the documents on the table in front of me, and looked at the room for a moment. My name was on these documents in a way it had never appeared before. Not as a condition, not as a clause embedded in a private side letter, but as a named participant, printed clearly, taking up space it had earned. Hector arrived 8 minutes later, in person this time. No representative. He came through the door with the unhurried ease of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. When he saw me, he crossed the room directly and we shook hands. The way two people shake hands when they have been through something real together and emerged with their regard for each other not only intact but deepened. No performance, no speech, just two people who had built something across 12 years and were about to formalize what it had always actually been. We sat. Rodrigo arranged the documents in sequence. Hector's equity partners joined by video. 3 faces on a screen positioned at the end of the table, professional and attentive. The room held the particular quiet of people who were present for something that mattered and knew it. Raphael arrived 4 minutes before the hour. He came in without Camila, without an attorney performing confidence on his behalf. He nodded to me when he entered. I nodded back. He took his seat across the table and placed his hands flat in front of him and looked at the documents waiting for him. He looked like a man who had made peace with something he had not chosen but had accepted. There is a specific kind of dignity available to people who accept what is true after resisting it. It does not announce itself, but it is visible to anyone paying attention. The signing took 40 minutes. Documents moved around the table in sequence, reviewed, initialed, signed. Hector's partners confirmed their portions by video. The restructured entity was acknowledged by every signatory. My equity stake was formalized on page 7. A defined percentage, my name printed above the signature line in clean black type. Raphael's operational role was executed on page 11. The anchor parcel transfer was recorded. The escrow condition was satisfied in writing. Rodrigo confirmed the funds release with a single nod. Then the document acknowledging my equity stake reached Raphael for his required signature. He picked up the pen, found the line and stopped. The room did not react. Nobody shifted in their chair. Nobody looked at anyone else. The quiet simply held itself in place while Raphael sat with whatever he was sitting with. The full accumulated weight of what the page in front of him represented, what it had cost to arrive at it, what his name on that line meant about every decision that had led to this moment. He signed slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. When he looked up, he looked at me, not at Hector, not at Rodrigo, at me. What passed between us in that moment was not forgiveness. Forgiveness requires more than a conference room and a signed page. And we both understood that without saying it, but it was acknowledgement that we were still in the same story. That the story was not finished. Hector stood when the last document was executed, moved around the table, shaking hands. When he reached me, he held my hand a moment longer than the others and said quietly, "Thank you for coming back." I said, "Thank you for waiting." 12 words. 12 years underneath them. I walked out of the building into Atlanta September light and stopped on the Peachtree Street sidewalk. My city, my name on the right documents, my deal structured the way it should have been structured from the beginning. My phone buzzed. Text from Camila. 1 sentence. "She's moving. Doctor says 6 weeks." I stood on that sidewalk with the afternoon sun on my face and thought about a child arriving into a world that had been through something significant before she got here. And I made a decision, one nobody who had been sitting at that dinner table on a Tuesday night would have seen coming. Raphael called at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday in late October. I was already awake, had been sitting with coffee at my kitchen table, watching the Atlanta morning arrive the way it arrives in October, slower than summer, the light coming in at a lower angle, the city looking like it had taken a breath and was holding it. When his name appeared on my screen, I set the cup down and answered. His voice was different from every version of it I had heard across the past several months. The strategy was gone from it. The anxiety was gone. The specific weight a man carries when he knows he has done wrong and has not yet fully settled the account with himself. That was gone too. What remained was simpler and older than any of that. He said, "She's here, Mama. She's here and she's perfect." I sat with those words for a moment. Let them be exactly what they were. Then I told him I was on my way. I did not rush. That was a choice. And I was aware of making it, not as a statement, not as a withholding, but as the natural pace of a woman who had decided exactly what she was walking toward, and felt no urgency about arrival, because she already knew she was going. I parked in the hospital garage, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, walked the corridor with its particular institutional light and its particular institutional quiet, and stopped in front of the room number Raphael had texted me. I knocked once. He opened the door, stepped aside without speaking. Camila was in the bed with a child wrapped in a white blanket held against her chest. She looked up when I came through the door. Neither of us spoke for a moment. We had already said the things that needed saying at a restaurant table weeks ago. What was in this room now did not require words as its entry point. She held the baby out toward me, both arms extending, not as a negotiation, not as a gesture calculated for effect, simply as what it was, an offering. The most significant thing she had extended without condition. I sat on the edge of the bed and took my granddaughter. I held her the way you hold a baby when you have held babies before, with the settled confidence of a woman who knows exactly how much a new life weighs and how to distribute that weight so the child feels nothing but security. Her eyes were closed. Her face was the face of someone who had just arrived from somewhere else entirely and had not yet formed an opinion about this world. In its unfinished openness, it held every face I had ever loved. I sat with her and did not perform anything. Sonia was not in the room. I noticed and moved past the noticing without stopping on it. A week earlier, Camila had told me she and her mother were speaking less. Not estranged, not at war. Just careful now in a way they had never been before. Some kinds of trust survive being questioned. Others survive only after being rebuilt. Whatever was happening between them belonged to them. I was not a party to it and had no interest in becoming one today. Raphael sat in the chair across the room. He watched me hold his daughter with the expression of a man who was seeing something he understood he had almost made impossible. After a while he said quietly, "I keep thinking about what you said in Birmingham about protecting me so completely I couldn't see what I was standing on." He paused. "I don't want her to have that. I want her to know what things are worth from the beginning." I looked at him over the baby's head. "Then you know what you have to do differently." He nodded. It was not absolution. Neither of us treated it as one, but it was the first stone of something laid quietly without ceremony in a hospital room in late October. I drove home in the afternoon. October light through the windshield, lower and softer than summer. Atlanta moving past me like a city that had been through something and come out the other side still standing. I thought about the woman who had stood behind her mother at a restaurant table and told me the best gift I could give my grandchild was to disappear forever. I thought about everything that disappeared when I did. The deal they believed was already theirs. The confidence that had no foundation beneath it. The version of my son who had once sat in a private room and called his mother a complication. All of it gone. Replaced by something that had required everything to build, but would last in the way that things last when they are built correctly. A project with my name on the right documents. A granddaughter who arrived into a family that had survived itself. A son who was beginning, one slow day at a time, to understand what things were worth. I pulled into my driveway, sat for a moment. The Atlanta evening settled around the car. Then I said it quietly to no one but myself and the city and anyone who had ever been told their disappearance would be someone else's gift. She told me the best gift I could give was to disappear. She had no idea what I'd take with me when I left.